Are you a church leader trying to navigate the tension of doing ministry both online and in person? Welcome to the Bricks and Clicks Church Leadership Podcast, a podcast where church leaders and ministry experts share ideas, solutions, and experiences about making church work both in person and online. Meet the hosts of Bricks and Clicks, a Brit and an Aussie who became friends in their efforts of making churches irresistible. Duncan Banks lives just outside London, England, and Jason Perkins lives in Brisbane, Australia. Without further ado, here are your hosts, Banksy and Perko.
My name's Jason Perkins, and I have the privilege of being involved in a network of churches here in Australia called the Irresistible Churches Network. And we're so happy to be able to have Jim Tomberlin with us this morning. Here in Australia, at least, it's this morning. Jim, you're in Colorado Springs. It's the afternoon. We live in the future, but you live a little bit in the past. But how's the weather? How are things in Colorado Springs today as you guys are entering fall, autumn?
Well, it started out to be a very cool morning, and it ended up to be a very warm day, as it typically does this time of the year. And so it's in no humidity. It's a great place to live. So
yeah, that's awesome. So as you're joining into the webinar today, I'd love it if you just jump into the chat, type in your name, where you're at, and what church you're affiliated with. That would really help us out. So I'm just going to type that into the chat right now as well. Jim, while I'm doing that, can you just give us a little bit of background on your life, ministry? Man, you've worked in a number of really fantastic churches over the years. You've been a lead pastor of a church, several churches. You've helped out with the MultiSite movement from the very early days of that in the 90s. Give people a little bit of background on who you are.
Well, first of all, I want to say, Jason, thank you for the privilege of being on your show today, your program. And it's an honor. I had the joy of getting to know you when you lived here in Colorado Springs. And I appreciate our friendship and your ministry. You are well loved here and missed.
Thanks,
but it's a great privilege to be with you today, and to all of our friends down under.
That's it, down under. Yeah.
In a day ahead.
Yes.
So, but I've been a pastor for over 4 decades. I was one of the early multi-site pioneers that began right here with me in my church in Colorado Springs at Woodman Valley Chapel back in the mid-90s. Where I started down that path as one of the early multi-site church pioneers. That got me invited to come to Willow Creek Community Church in Chicago to develop the multi-site model in the early 2000s, the early part of this century. And so I was there for 5 years and launched the first 4 additional campuses of Willow Creek. But then I left Willow Creek because so many churches were calling me across the U.S. saying, Jim, could you come talk to us about how you do this multi-site thing? Yeah. And so after believing I'd accomplished what I'd supposed to do there at Willow Creek, and today there are over 8 locations, and I left Willow Creek in Chicago to serve the body of Christ, initially in the U.S. and then Europe and as well, and South America. And so we as one of those early pioneers, I rode that wave of the multi-site movement, which is still growing, still expanding. In the middle of all the multi-site movement, this new kind of merger emerged and became one of the early pioneers in helping churches through mergers, a different kind of merger today, which we're going to talk about. But so for the last 15 years, I've been a church consultant. And last year, I merged my company, MultiSite Solutions, with my good friend Tony Morgan and the Unstuck Group. Yeah. Meanwhile, I am serving as the chief of staff of a church in Miami, where it's a multi-site church, 17 locations, 7 across Miami, 10 across South America. And so that's kind of my life in the last 4 decades. I've had the privilege of working with several great churches over the years.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. So Jim, you and I have chatted a little bit about church mergers, and the part of the reason why we started chatting about it is you have just re-released an expanded and updated version of Better Together, which is up on the
thank you.
screen.
I have my copy too.
Yeah, good. So. Yeah, I'm sure you have more than one, but you have just put this out. Tell us a little bit about the book. When you first wrote it, when was that? And then also tell us a little bit, as people are jumping on and telling us where they're tuning in from and the name of their church and so on. tell us a little bit about as well why you've expanded and updated it, and some of the things, even with COVID, that you've included.
Well, the first edition was released in 2012. Okay. And that came as a result of my good friend Warren Bird at Leadership Network at the time, vice president there, called me in around 2009 and said, Jim, are you seeing a lot of church mergers in your multi-site church consulting? And I said, I am. And he replied and said, so are we at Leadership Network. And we ought to write a book about it because God is doing something new. It's a different kind of merger we're seeing. And so I agreed, and 3 years later, we released the first edition of Better Together, Making Church Mergers Work. And what we discovered in that first book, these were a different kind of mergers than the old failed mergers of the past that were more survival driven. These were more mission driven mergers. And the main catalyst or primary catalyst for these kind of new mergers was the multi-site church movement, which and the primary beneficiary of mergers was multi-site churches. Back then, 8 years ago, 30% of all multi-site campuses had come as a result of a merger with another church joining them. Fast forward, we just did another survey of nearly 1,000 churches for this book, for this edition. And that number has climbed to 40% of multi-site campuses have come by way of a merger. Now, our publisher came to us last year and said, Jim, Warren, your book is a strong selling book. We'd like to make it in paperback to make it even more accessible. We think it's would be even more useful. Would you be okay with us doing that? And we said on one condition, if you would allow us to update it and expand it. Yeah. And they said, that'd be fantastic. And so that was last fall. When they asked us to do that, and we were targeting this fall, 2020, to release it. Had no idea, of course, of COVID and all that, but everything that we finished it right when COVID, broke loose. We were able to write about COVID in our book and how its impact on mergers. It only reinforced everything that we were seeing, a growing trend since our first book. More mergers are happening, certainly with multi-site churches, but we're also seeing a lot of other applications of mergers as well. And now with the COVID and the impact that's having on churches, this is only accelerating what we were seeing before COVID.
Yeah. I love, by the way, Jim, I love the foreword in the book from Craig Groeschel and the story that he tells of how they went multi-site through a church reaching out to him in Tulsa, asking him to come and pastor their church. And finally, after multiple times being asked, he said, hey, listen, the only way this thing will work is if your church becomes a part of Life Church and becomes a campus. And that started their multi-site movement for Life Church. And they now have 35 locations plus online and a number of their locations. Not all 35 of those are ones that they launched. A large percentage of those are ones that they've acquired through church mergers.
Their very first, multi-site, their second campus came by through a merger. Yeah. And by the way, that 35th location they just opened up was right here in Colorado Springs.
Colorado Springs, yes, yeah.
And I went to the grand opening, and they started with offering one service, and they went immediately to two.
So good.
The first weekend.
Yeah, I love that. Well, listen, Jim, I've got a number of questions, and I want you to share some resources as well that we're going to give away to people that are on the webinar today. But I know that those that are watching the webinar, I see a number of people on there. Thanks, Dan, for telling us where you're watching from, and for Gordon and Joseph and Joe and others. Thanks for chiming in on where you're watching from. If you haven't done so already, we'd love it if you would just put your name, location, where you're at, and the name of the church that you're affiliated with. That would be awesome. The other thing I'd love you to do in the chats, this is super important, because although I've got some questions that I want to ask Jim, I am actually more interested in you guys that are watching the webinar asking the questions that are specific to your context, what you're dealing with right now. So if you would do me a favor, put your question for Jim in the chat. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to select a few people to actually join us as a panelist in the webinar and have you ask your question directly to Jim. So if you've got a burning question about multi-site or about church merger that you're dealing with, maybe you're considering it, or maybe you're going through a merger right now, or maybe you're on the other side, you've already merged, what's the burning question that you have on your mind right now that you'd like to ask Jim? But to get us started, Jim, while people are putting that into the chat, here's what I would love to do. I would love for you to share with us, who are the candidates for a church merger? What's the type of church that's a prime candidate for considering a church merger?
Well, that's a great place to start, Jason. And I would say that in the U.S., and I don't know what the numbers are in UK. I mean, I saw talking to the UK last week, in Australia.
Yeah. In Australia,
that there's around 320,000 Protestant churches across the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
The average size of a church in America, so many will be surprised by this, is around 75 people in attendance.
Yeah.
Now, I put all of those churches into three categories. The first one would be those who are in the struggling category. Okay. And at the Unstuck Group, which is our church consulting group that I'm a part of, we've actually developed a tool and really broken down the life cycles, the 7 stages of the life cycle of a church. And I have found that these 7 stages apply to any church anywhere in the world. Yeah. And we actually have a free assessment tool on our website that you can go and take a test, a self-assessment, and see where your church is, what stage is in its life cycle. But we'll walk through those 7 stages in a moment, but I put all of these churches into 3 categories. Struggling is clearly the primary prime candidate for a church merger. A struggling church, about 25% in America are struggling. That is, they're in life support or preservation mode. Yeah. And they were vulnerable before COVID, and COVID has only made them more vulnerable as a result. And so they are clearly a good candidate for merging. As a matter of fact, in our survey that we did of nearly 1,000 churches last fall, that the majority of mergers are initiated, church mergers are initiated by a struggling church, not the strong growing church.
Right.
Now, and you know, they're either struggling for one or two reasons. Either they're financially in trouble, they're not able to make their financial obligations, their income is down, their attendance is down. And so they're clearly in survival mode. Now, many other churches, though, they're not necessarily financially in trouble, but they have mission drift. They've lost their way of learning how to minister in the 21st century, how to make disciples, how to engage the culture today. And so they recognize, if we stay on this path, we're going to go out of business. And so struggling churches are clearly good candidates for a merger. But they're also, in the U.S., there's about 60% of the churches that are in maintenance mode. I call those, they're stuck. And status quo. Now, many of them don't even know or realize they're stuck, and others are okay being stuck. But many of these stuck churches, which is really the majority of the churches in the U.S., they may be without a pastor, or a pastor who's ready to retire, and these churches are finding that a merger can be a vehicle for revitalization and to get unstuck. And so that's another candidate for mergers. But there's also what I call the strong churches, and that represents about 15% of the churches in the U.S. that they're mission driven. They're clear about their vision. They have a discipleship pathway. God's favor has been on them, and they're reaching people, and they're making disciples who make disciples. And they're growing. And so many of those churches are looking for additional campuses, facilities, or space. They're looking to help other churches become healthy in their community because they care about them. There are many times there are church planters that, they're experiencing explosive growth, and they're in a rented building, and they're looking for a permanent facility. Or they're a multi-site church that's looking for more locations. And so these are also good candidates for a merger. So the question is, who's a good candidate for a church merger? All churches are, but for different reasons.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's fantastic. I've got a couple of people that are throwing questions into the chat, and we'll get to those in just a moment. What about these life cycles that you mentioned before? Yeah. You were talking about the candidates, and you said that the Unstuck Group, you guys have actually developed a tool, and you said that churches can go online and take the assessment to find out where they're
at. It's a free assessment. We've had over 15,000 churches do this in the U.S. and beyond the U.S. as well.
Okay.
And so this would be a great place. I think every church ought to where are we on the life cycle?
Yeah.
And this will help understand what would be our next step or that we should be taking.
So Jim, walk us through the life cycle. I'm going to bring that up on the screen so that people can see that. But if you'd walk us through it, that'd be
well,
super
obviously
helpful.
The first stage is the startup growth, launch growth. Yep. And for those new church startups that have the good benefit of breaking out of 100, very few churches get beyond 200 in the U.S. And I find that if you don't break past 200 in the U.S. Within a couple of years, you probably won't. In terms of 200 people, total people in attendance, adults and children and all.
Yes.
And usually there needs a new leader, typically, to get them to the next place. But those churches that are fortunate to break out of the 200 barrier, they experience that momentum growth, and you can see the percentages. And this just breaks down from all those who've taken the assessment with us. Yeah. And those churches, that momentum growth, and your church had that in Colorado Springs, but many churches are growing out of momentum because of the gifting on their team. God is blessing them. They don't even really know what they're doing right. They're working out of their gifting,
Well, Jim, that was something that we paid a lot of attention to when I was leading that church was we would say oftentimes, hey guys, if we don't know why we're experiencing growth, then it's really going to be hard to protect those things that we're doing if we don't know what they are. So I think that's an important thing to pay attention to. If you are growing, why are we growing? What are we seeing God do? How is he breathing life into this place? So that's a great point. Go ahead.
And that's the right question to get to the third stage. And that is, all right, what is God blessing? What are we doing right? Let's capture that and make sure that we don't lose that, and that we build on that, and that we, continue in that path and of what God is giving favor to us, how we're doing ministry here. And so we get that strategic growth and begin to standardize and say, let's stay true to those things. And then the goal for every church is to get to that sustained health where we're healthy. Not every year is a growing year necessarily, but but are we healthy? And you can see 1% of churches are in that category.
That mode. Yeah.
And so where it's sustained health, that's a hard place to stay. Now, everything to the left of that bell graph there is positive and healthy. And that's in that 15% of growing churches that could be a lead church in a merger. But then, churches tend to begin to slip down to the right side of the bell graph. And many times they don't realize that until they're already gotten way down the graph, but about, 60% are in the maintenance mode. And that's probably true. I suspect these is reflective of even the church across Australia as well.
I would say, Jim, that what you're describing, some of these numbers that you're describing are probably going to be unfortunately, a little bit less in Australia as far as like churches that break the 200 barrier. Or don't break it in the first few years, that barrier is probably going to be about 100, 150 in Australia. When you look at these percentages, I would say that 15% growing would be a very generous percentage for Australian churches, just to be, transparent and honest.
Well, we should start tracking with the Australian assessments, see where this goes.
And we do have some great friends at the McCrindle Group.
Yes,
I've mentioned those guys to you before. Jim, Mark, and his team do a fantastic job of collecting data and making it available to us. So I know that those numbers are out there. Yeah.
In maintenance mode, there's not necessarily a financial issue. Many times that's what keeps churches thinking, hey, we're doing fine, or we're paying our bills. We have a steady, solid group of people that are staying with us. But if you're not really growing, then you're losing ground and just don't realize it. But then other churches, as they go down that side, they move from maintenance mode to now we're in preservation. We're just trying to hold, it's the slippery slope is going further down. And then life support, where really we're not far away from going out of business in those last two categories. And so that's every church finds itself in one of those places. Now, the good news is, well, the good news is in church world, just like in spiritual world, you can have a rebirth. You can have a new chapter, a second start. Now, a really sad statistic that just came out from the Barna Group here in the States, David Kinnaman, the president, just said last week here in August, the month of August, that 1 out of 5 churches in North America or in the U.S. are in danger of going out of business in the next 18 months. And that's congruent with our chart. That's about 20% of all of the churches in the U.S. That's over 60,000 churches, Jason.
Yeah.
But you don't have to go out of business. You can have a second life through a merger. A merger is better than death and the end. And we like to tell churches, if you stay on this path, especially in that last 25% of preservation, life support, you're going to go out of business.
Yeah. And
your story will be over. But if you have a chance to choose your destiny and not have it chosen for you, you could choose to throw your lot to join with the vibrant church, prevailing church that's in your community or in your region, and have your chapter will end, but your story will continue on.
Yeah.
And so that's a better outcome than just becoming a pub or
restaurant or whatever. Yeah. Yeah. Hey, Jim, I want to bring in one of our attendees, Michael from Perth. I'm going to see if he's available to join us as a panelist. We're getting a few questions around what I would call questions around stages of a merger and also not just stages of a merger, but also the timeline of a merger. Like, what would you suggest as far as timelines are concerned? Michael, I think you're muted right now, but you're live with us now. You're on audio wise, man. Michael, first of all, thanks for being a part of the webinar. So good to see your face, mate. Michael is executive pastor at a church in Perth called The Rocks. And Michael, I'll let you ask your question and maybe even give some context to it, because you guys are right in the midst of acquiring a campus or merging a church and going through that. So go for it.
Well, thank you so much for having us. And this is very helpful for churches in Australia. Our church have been around for about 15 years. And then this year, we had about 3 gatherings before COVID, and maybe about 850 adults and maybe about 150 kids, so about 1,000 people. And then by the grace of God, early this year, a church about 40 kilometers down south of our location has been praying and decided to join together with the Rocks Cannington and now also Baldavis. And then so they officially become the Rocks on the 1st of July 2020. So now it's almost 2 months already.
2 months.
So it's happened.
Yeah, it has happened. And then our church, fortunately, we can go back to meet physically starting from June, first week of June. So WA, Western Australia, we have no new transmission in COVID. So everything can go back almost to normal starting from June. So now we've been meeting for the past two months in person. So the past 4 weeks, we have been having a gathering as the Rocks Baldavis. And my question would be, what would be a typical timeline for alignment? So I guess we would like to get as many people on board with the mission, strategy, and vision. And at the same time, we need to make sure that the campus in Cannington also being healthy and keep producing good leaders. And what are the strategies for alignment, and also maybe the timeline, the typical timeline of a church merge?
Well, it's a great question. And we've asked that question in our surveys, and our experience has been that how long does it take to make that full integration? We talk about the 3 stages in the integration phase, the last phase, where you're at now, which we call now is the marriage has begun, so to speak. is to stabilize. Now, let me ask. So this is a multi-site campus, Michael, that's become a multi-site campus for you, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the first stage is to stabilize. If it was in decline, let's stabilize it and stop the downward flow financially and attendance wise. Maybe that was an issue, maybe not. But stabilization is the first phase in the integration. The second stage is growth. All right, now let's start growing that location, adding the services, seeing more people come, making an impact in the community. And then the third phase to multiply. Can we birth another campus or congregation out of that one? So those are the three phases, but of the three steps in the integration stage. Let me back up though, Michael, and say, I think the key to integration is all the work you do before the merger is finalized. And all that, by the way, in our surveys and our experience, is the average length of time in this whole 5 stages, or the 4 stages in the 5th stages, ongoing, up to the time of the merger approved, from the initial conversation to the final approval, and then we're doing it, as 8 months. Has been our experience, and it's from our surveys. Now, I think it's very important in the merger conversation that you establish upfront 2 things. Very important. It'll save you churches a lot of headaches and misunderstandings down the road. The first conversation that needs to happen is defining the relationship. That is, every merger is like a slow dance where one leads and the other follows. You can't have 2 leads and you can't have 2 follows in a merger, in a dance, to be a successful dance, and the same in a merger. You have to determine who's the lead church and who's the follow church. Now, or who's the joining church. The lead church is really the church that is going to be the primary culture, the mission, the vision, the DNA that the joining church is being absorbed into or integrated under the lead church. And so it's very important up front who's the lead and who's the follow. Now, the second thing that's very important is to determine what kind of merger we have. Now, we'll come back to those questions in a moment, Jason. But we've identified in our book 4 kinds of mergers, or 4 models. And all mergers fall into one of these categories. Not all mergers are the same. Is this a rebirth merger, which is what the primary mergers are? The majority of mergers tend to be a rebirth, and that's more like a joining church that's being fully absorbed into the lead church. They don't really bring anything beyond their passion as individuals and heart for God, and they bring their lives. They maybe bring a building, but they don't have programs or staff or things that you're going to incorporate into your church. Because they're obsolete, or they're just not that needed in your church. But the greatest asset of any merger are the people that come with the merger. Maybe they bring a building with them as well. But that's a full rebirth where they give up everything and they get in exchange life. And so the next kind of merger is what we call an adoption merger, which is more like an integration. That is, they bring their lives, they bring maybe a facility, but they also bring maybe some programs, some ministries, some things that they're doing that the lead church says, you know what, we really like what you're doing. We really like to integrate that into our, who we are as a church, and make that a part of our church. And so variations here, but adoption is another kind of merger. Then there's what we call a marriage merger, which is a very rare merger where it kind of implies equality, like a marriage, like 2 people coming together. They're bringing their best, the good and the bad, and they're like, let's create something new together. There's very few marriage mergers where they're truly equal and just say, let's create something new together. But even in those marriage mergers, there's usually one that leads and one that follows. There are different stages in their life cycle, healthy, but in different stages. Then the last kind is what we call ICU, stands for intensive care unit. Do you call that? That's what you call it in Australia?
Yep. ICU. Yep. We know that lingo.
And really, those were the kind of mergers of the past, which nobody really welcomed or embraced with enthusiasm. They really typically are 2 declining churches that are both in survival mode, trying to survive at the expense of the other. And like an ICU, it's kind of the last stop before we die, and hopefully we could survive. Like two drowning men in a lake or ocean, they're trying to survive at the expense of the other. Now, all that, depending on the clarity that the two churches have going into this conversation, the less conflict they're going to have on the other side of the merger. So I don't know how you would describe what your experience. Was it a rebirth or an adoption?
Maybe right now more into rebirth.
Yeah.
But also there are a few programs that we actually, for example, the kids summer camp that we're going to have this coming summer. We don't have it in our Cannington campus, but because for the past few years, it's been successful back in Baldivis. So that's the one that we are going to do as well this coming summer. So it's more towards the rebirth, but there are a few that we...
A lot of churches don't see themselves as a rebirth, although they really are. Okay. And sometimes the adoption language is a little softer, perhaps, when they're explaining this to their church congregations. Jason, we also talked about the 5 stages here. I think might be helpful to
bring that up.
Walk through that again as well, because I think we've really broken down this whole merger conversation into 5 stages. And we use the analogy here of human relationships. The first stage being the exploration, where it's like dating. When you're meeting somebody, you're asking the question, I wonder if this is a potential partner. And so you had those questions
Jim,
up a moment.
Jim, you have those 3 questions that we had up just a second ago, which are initial questions. But you have in your book 25 key questions or key things to sort through. Yeah. And that really saves the pain later on, almost like premarital counseling in a sense, as I like to describe it. It's like premarital counseling for churches, to go through these 25 key questions or things to sort out so that you don't run into that pain later on down the road.
In the exploration stage, that's the dance, and that's where you're defining who's the lead and who's the follow. That's the first issue. Then you go like in dating, when it becomes more it goes moving from dating to this is a potential partner. It moves into courtship. So it's a negotiation stage. And in that stage, we've identified 25 distinct issues that you just mentioned. We have it in our book. Every merger has these 25 issues. Every merger has to address them. Most of these issues are benign. They're not deal breakers, but there's usually 4 or 5 that are very crucial to whether the merger could come to pass or not. And each church, the lead church issues will be different than the joining church's issues. But they're in that negotiation stage, that courtship stage, is when we're really asking the question. The first question in stage 1 is this possible? Yes. Stage 2 is, all right, it's nice, it's possible, but is it really feasible? Is it really, are we compatible enough to really join together? That's what you're wrestling through on stage 2, their negotiation. And as you work through those 25 issues, typically the 2 pastors and the 2 boards or the 2 leadership teams, they do that hard work of working through those 25 issues. In our book, we've given you the template. Also, we've given you a couple of examples of how churches have addressed those issues. But then if you work through those and you agree, you know what? We are not only, is it possible, it's feasible. We can agree on these things. We can move forward this. We could do this. And now we're ready to declare to our churches, we think God is leading us to join together. It's like an engagement. Do you call it engagement in Australia when you announce we're going to get married and there's a date, and so it's all about communication there. That's the issue there. It's very important to over communicate to the 2 congregations. We've been meeting, we've been praying, we've been working through the issues, and we believe God is leading us to join together. And now we want to roll, and then you roll out an FAQ, a frequently asked questions document, maybe there's about 10 questions that every church member has on their mind. Why are we doing this? How did it come about? Who will be our pastor? What will be our church name? What will happen to our building?
Michael right now is going, oh yeah, those are frequently asked questions.
You've had those questions, right, Michael?
Michael's going, I've answered those questions for 200 people for the last 3 months.
Now, very important. It's very important in this declaration stage to over communicate and to be clear, to be concise, and to be consistent at both churches. We're saying the same thing in unity with to both congregations. We're trying to preempt as many questions as possible by having already addressed these and rolling out, having a lot of meetings, town halls, etc. That's that communication stage 3 declaration. Then that's leading up to the consolidation, the actual wedding, what we call the wedding. It's where the two churches vote, or at least the joining church votes. Michael, did your church have to, as the lead church, did your church vote to approve the merger?
We just need to put it into our AGM, which we did. So it was like a report into our AGM that we will go through this process. But the joining church, Baldivis, they did have a special general meeting, and then they officially closed the organization and then rejoined us.
Many congregations would require a congregational vote to approve joining another church, and there's buildings, there's assets, there's property. There's a lot that goes with that, and they have to give them a chance to approve that. Some churches don't, the congregation doesn't get to approve that. It's a board decision or even a denominational decision or network decision. But I recommend, even when the congregation doesn't have the authority to do the final approval, you should give them the opportunity to affirm what the leadership have decided, have recommended, or have approved. To give them a chance to affirm that, and not for their permission, but for their ownership, and give them a chance to ask their questions and all that sort of thing.
I love that advice, Jim. I love that advice, just to give, even if it's not in your constitution required, but to give people the chance to affirm it. I think that's such a powerful step of providing ownership. That's so good. And
then we started with you a few moments ago, Michael. The 5th stage is really the ongoing stage now of marriage, and the goal there is to stabilize, grow, and multiply, just like a family would.
Yeah. Hey, Michael, dude, thank you so much for jumping in, so that you don't have to feel like everyone's staring at you for the rest of the webinar. I'm going to kick you back out to attendee, but I hope that was helpful for you. And just so you know as well, we're going to be providing all the resources I've been bringing up on the screen. We're going to get those out to everyone, and I even have a copy of Jim's book that I'm going to give away to some lucky winner. So we'll get.
Just happen to have a copy, a picture of it.
Is it available?
It is available. Sorry, we just lost Michael, and I think he was about to ask, is it available? The answer is yes, it's available on Amazon. You can pick it up on Amazon. That's actually how I got my copy, thanks to Jim sending me one through Amazon. So you can grab that. And even here in Australia, I think it only took a couple of days to get here. So I've got, Jim, I've got Dan Sweetman, who's here in Queensland. He's actually just around the corner from where I'm at. And he has a question. This is somebody that's on the other end of the merger process to what Michael and the team in Perth are talking about. Dan, you're just having some initial conversations right now. And you've got some questions around a few churches. I'd love for you to just ask Jim. Give some context, Dan, where you're at, what church are you leading, and then give Jim the question that you had.
Thanks, mate. Yeah, I hope no one sees this from my church, because I have no idea any of this.
We'll keep it under wraps,
including my stuff.
Yeah.
But I'm pastor of a church, probably small church, probably medium-sized church in Australia, but definitely small church for the US, of about maybe 300, 400 people. And there's another church that's down the road from us, about kind of 20 kilometers away. I don't know what that is in miles.
It's about 12, 15 miles. Yep.
Yeah. Perfect. And there's another church that's maybe more like 60 miles north. And we've just had one email chain, really, just talking about how we're very similar. We're both in a healthy stage, probably, but I wouldn't say a fast-growing stage. We both, my church is only a church plant. We've only been around 10 years. Mm-hmm. The other two have been around for more like 30, 40 years. And we're just, two of us actually already have the same name, weirdly, and we're all Baptist churches. But yeah, we were just talking, and we're thinking, is there a benefit to talking about a partnership? Is there a benefit to talking about a merger? There seemed to be a little bit of excitement about it, and I'm just wondering, like, it's a lot of work when we're all doing okay. So, Jim, someone like you, like, you know, the legend, what would you say? Like, I looked at all your diagrams you're putting up, and I'm just thinking, oh, it's a lot of work, and we're doing fine. Do we need to do this? What's the benefits, really? Is my question. Why should we, or why shouldn't we even consider this?
It's a great question, Dan. And we have developed 4 diagnostic questions for churches that are exploring the possibility of joining together. And I think when I hear about 2 churches that really, we're doing okay, but you know, the title of our book is, but could we be better together? Where in a lot of ways is the most fun kind of mergers, because you're both bringing a lot of strength to the table. You're not desperate, and you're not once in you know, survival mode. That we really could do something even better together. So we have 4 questions to help answer that question. The first question would be, would my congregation, you know, your individual congregation, would my congregation be better by merging with this other one rather than remaining separate? The first question. Would my local congregation be better by joining? The second question would be, could we accomplish more together than we could separately? And that's the whole synergy, you know, could we, one pastor in our book said, you know, when we joined, it was 1 + 1 = 3 is the synergy, you know, of you know, the sum total is better than the individual parts. But he said, you know, 1 + 1 in our case equaled 10. It was just off the chart how much better we were, and the synergy that we created by joining together, bringing our strengths together. The third question.
Why, like, what is it about it? Sorry to interrupt you, Jim.
Yeah.
Nice. That's good.
Well, it's kind of like what Solomon said in Ecclesiastes when he said 2 are better than 1 because they have a better reward for their labor. It's just the power of, and my team, we like to say, when we're making a big decision, an important decision, wrestling with a decision, none of us is as smart as all of us. And then collectively, we land on the best, you know, the best idea wins, you know. But I think it's just a matter of, it's a lot of ways like a single parent versus a 2-parent family. There's more strength, more synergy when it's right. When it's right. When it's not right, then that's not good. But I think a third question would be: would the community that we are part of, would it be better served if we join together? And then lastly, I think really the most important one: could the kingdom of God be further enlarged by joining together? So you have to ask those questions. Now, there have been times when I've asked those questions with some churches, and my opinion would be, I don't think you would be better served, better off joining with this church. It's going to be too contentious. There's not a sense of God is bringing us together. One church is more about saving a building versus, you know, making more disciples. I mean, all kinds of things, but maybe it's not going to be good for one or both. But if you can answer yes to any one of those 4 questions or more, there's a good chance it's worth exploring the possibility.
Okay.
Dan, is that helpful? Do you have a follow-up question to that you're like, talk to me about, like, what are some key, like, immediately my thought comes to mind of what are some examples of being better together that you might, you know, explore possibly?
Yeah. I guess my question, and this is very practical, but is, kind of what you're saying, Jason, like, is it the back end systems are better because they're all just one system's managing them all? Is it that, you know, their children's ministry can be better because they can buy things on a bigger scale? I'm just, because I'm such an early stage, literally just, I don't know, on your diagram, we're just dating, or we're not even dating yet. We're just kind of flirting.
You slid into their DMs.
Slid
into their DMs.
That's all that's going on.
You know, two pastors might, you know, one might be, I love preaching. I'm really weak on organizational leadership. The other, like, you know, being that organizational leader is more life-giving to me than having to prepare a message every week. That's just the two of you. It's a gifting thing. Is the gifting complementing, or is it clashing? If you both got to be the only preacher, then that's probably not going to be a good fit. But if there's a complementary roles there, but you mentioned some others. They may be the other church might be really good in one area of ministry, like children, and it's an area of weakness for us. Or So I mean, that's where do we really have synergy by joining together? And could our impact be greater in our broader community, greater and stronger?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a good way of looking at it.
Dan, thanks for asking your question. If we ever put this out publicly, we'll blur out your face and change all the names of the churches and everything.
I would say, let me add something else to Dan. A lot of churches, especially where God is blessing, only 25% of the churches in America are healthy growing, but that's still not a small number. And I just believe the churches that God is giving favor to, that they have an opportunity to really help strengthen the body of Christ. And there's some effort, there's some relational work you have to do. There's some expense that's going to be done. If you're a strong church, should you consider helping other churches be healthy by the vehicle of a merger? When we asked the question of 1,000 churches last year, why did you merge? The strong churches said 2 reasons. Why did you even enter merging? One was the slightly higher percentage was we wanted to help revitalize other churches in our community. And just right under, almost equal, was we wanted to reach more people. We could reach more people by merging. And so now when we asked the joining churches the same thing, they said 2 reasons. Financial survival, we weren't going to make it. And so it was survival for us. But others said it wasn't financial. We didn't know how to reach people today. We lost our way. The church we joined with knew how to make disciples, was effective in it, was reaching the next generation. We wanted to be able to do that, but we didn't know how to do that. So it was more a missional reason or a financial reason.
No, it's good.
And if you
Dan, is that helpful?
Am I allowed one more question, Jason?
Oh yeah, one more question, mate. I'll charge. I'm gonna have to charge you more, but that's okay. You go ahead.
Put it on my voice.
Yeah.
The
sure, I understand. That was Siri.
Okay. The marriage thing that you said, you talked about how they're very rare, because you do need a church to lead. At the moment, I'm talking with me and then 2 other pastors, and it's very early, but there's not a clear. There's one church that's a lot bigger than the rest, probably double the size. They're a little bit older. You have to have a leader, don't you? You got to have one.
Well, yes. I mean, you have to unite around a common mission and vision. If all 3 are not happy with that, then you have a chance to come together. And could we create something new together? And actually 3 churches is a lot of ways is easier than 2, because it's important. We all recognize we have to change if 3 churches are going to come together. Now, if among the 3, there's clearly one, it's not about size. It's about health. Of the 3, who's the healthiest? Who's got the clearest vision for a mission, clearest vision, clear strategy? Who has a clear pathway for discipleship? That is, if nobody has that, this is a chance for all 3 of you to come together and let's create it together. Yeah. But if there's one that is leading the way in that, then that probably is what you ought to unite around. But the kind of mergers that succeed, that have good outcomes, where there's unity around a common mission, vision, and strategy.
Good. Yeah. Thanks so much.
Good.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for being willing to jump in and ask your question. I just dropped into the chats there. If anybody else has any other questions, I'd love to be able to direct them to Jim while we're waiting to see if anyone else has questions. Jim, are there any other things that you feel like, I feel like we've covered quite a bit. I know I feel like we've covered the things that that you and I had chatted about, stages of a merger,
Yep.
the best candidates, the life cycle. I love the analogy of the slow dance, like having a leader, having the follower. I know one of the people that's on the webinar today, Gordon Bassett, is actually with the church that merged with Michael's church. So he was the lead pastor and campus pastor at that church. And man, you've talked, Jim, and I'm going to ask this question. You've talked about what does the posture of that joining church look like? I actually think Gordon could probably write a white paper on how to be that joining church pastor, humility and all those kinds of things. So what would you say to those leaders?
Well, one of the things we also found from our surveys is that 79% of the joining church members stay with the merge on the other side. The majority of the people stay in the merger. And the same for the pastor, the joining church pastor, the vast majority, 80%, stay on board with the merged church. Usually if it's a multi-site campus, they don't usually stay as that pastor at that location, but they usually serve in some other location or some other role within the merged church. And so sometimes people ask me, well, what is a successful merger? And for me, success is defined not necessarily 100% everyone retaining everybody on the staff or in the church family or attendees, but those who do stay with you have 100% commitment to the new mission, the vision, the new strategy, the new vision of the church. For me, success is there a vibrant congregation there now that didn't exist before? It may be less people that was started, originally. If they land in some other church, that's fine. But and so to me, that's what we're seeing happen across the U.S. We have a lot of declining churches that are being lost, their property, et cetera, and to kingdom purposes. And this is a vehicle. It's becoming an option in the church's toolbox, a viable option for struggling, stuck, and strong churches. And I think that's the good news. This is something in our book. We just made the point. It's an option to consider. It's not a lose-lose or a win-lose. It can be a win-win solution for local churches.
Yeah, absolutely. Jim, I would love it if you would answer two questions for me. First question, how can people connect with you? What's the best place that they can connect with you? And then the second question is, how do you get a hold of this resource and other resources that you would recommend? Like I know that there are other resources that you love to recommend as well.
Well, the easiest way to reach me is through my email is jim@the unstuckgroup.com, unstuckgroup.com. I think one of the best things whether you're thinking of merger or not, I think every church ought to take our assessment that's on the unstuckgroup.com website. Just take that free assessment just to get a sense of what stage you're in your life cycle as a church. Reality is our friend, facts are our friends. And when we have clarity about where we are, it will help us to know what our next steps would be. Every church leader, every leader of any organization, but certainly a church, our primary role as a pastor, as a leader of a church, is to, first of all, define reality. Where are we now? What's the good and bad and the ugly of our situation? But more importantly, where do we want to go? Where do we believe God is leading us as a church?
Yeah.
And then as a leader is to figure out, okay, here's where we are now. Here's where we want to go. Figure out how do we get there. And then once you figure out how to get where you want to go, then the call to your congregation is, now follow me, church, as we follow Christ together. And so I think that to me would be the challenge and invitation to get a true assessment of where you're at and buy the book. If a merger is in your future, this will help you discern whether it's even something we should be considering. If another church approaches you or you approach a church about it, read the book together and to see if God says something to you about that. We talk about the 3 R's for the lead church pastor. how do you be a church merger friendly church leader? First R is relationships. The best merger outcomes come out of the soil of a relationship with other pastors, other churches.
Yeah.
And so as we get to know each other, and the possibility of merging can be discussed out of relationship. The second R is resource. If you are a lead church and God has blessed you and you're growing and you've got some resources, help the other churches in your community.
Yeah.
Offer,
so good.
we saw a lot of that here in the U.S. with some of the strong churches that when COVID hit, put out the appeal or the invitation to churches in their community. We did this in Miami. Hey, if you need help on recording your messages, we have a studio in our church. If you need help on teaching people how to give online, we'll help you with that. And so a lot of that was happening. And out of that comes friendships and trust. And then the third R is risk. Take the risk to make the ask. Ask another pastor in your community that you have a relationship with, that you've been partnering with in projects in your community. Hey, would it be worth considering us joining together?
Yeah.
Would you like to join us? Could we really be better together and better serving our community together?
Yeah. No, it's good.
Well, we hope this episode of Bricks and Clicks was helpful. If it was, then we'd love if you could leave us a review on your preferred podcast platform. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And if you are leading a church in Australia, the UK, or Ireland, we'd love to help you grow your church by reaching unchurched people. Go to www.bricksandclickpodcast.com and click on your country's flag to find a whole bunch of free resources to help your church go further, faster, and become irresistible once again.